In our last movie on Booleans, we got a little taste of how PHP will take something like a string which contains the number 0 and do some switching on it so that it's actually equivalent to 0. And I want to examine that a little more closely before we move on, because it's an important point. Let's create a new work area for ourselves and explore typecasting in more detail. I'm going to use Save As again, and I'm going to change my Booleans file to just be typecasting. We'll save it in my PHP sandbox. We'll go ahead and get rid of everything that we've worked with there in the Booleans file. We won't be needing that. And let's go ahead and change the name here to be typecasting. Now, we can call it typecasting, type switching, type juggling. The idea here is that out of all these different types that we've been working with, numbers, strings, that there's a fluidity between them and that we can actually switch from one type to another. And PHP will try and do this on its own. It has some pretty smart ideas about equivalency between the types. So, for example, if we have something like PHP, and we'll make a variable called variable1, and we'll set it equal to the number 2 inside a string. Now, that's a string. We've talked about that. It's not a number. But now let's go ahead and on the next line, let's say that variable1 should be plus equal to 3. And we talked about plus equals before. So now it's going to try and combine a string, which is 2, with the number 3. And the question is, how will it do? Well, let's go ahead and echo back the results. Echo variable1. And let's bring that up in our browser and see. We'll go back over here and we'll load up typecasting. And you'll see that it came back with 5. So it succeeded. It was able to take 2 and say, oh, you want to perform math on that? Then let me see if I can turn 2 into a number for you. And it did. And the number it came up with was 2. And therefore the operation succeeded and we came up with 5. Now this is bad programming in some ways because we would not want to actually rely on it to make this switch for us. And we should have had the right type to begin with. As another example, let's say that the string had actually been 2 brown foxes. And then we switch back and we try and add 2 to that. You'll see it still comes up with 5 for us because it takes the whole phrase 2 brown foxes and guesses, if I were going to try and convert that into a number, I bet the number I would want is 2. Now, as I said before, we don't want to rely on that, and we can tell it instead to set a type to be a certain thing. Let's try that. But first, let's learn another function, which is called getType, and that will tell us which type we're working with. So, for example, let's set a PHP block here, which is going to be echo getType, all run together, one word, getType for variable1. So we're going to echo that back to ourselves. And let's go ahead and make this, instead of being the same value incrementing, let's change it to be 2 different variables. So it's actually going to be variable2 is going to be equal to variable1 plus 3. It's the same result, but now we're going to have 2 different variables that we can test. We're going to have variable1 and we're going to have variable2. So let's see what we get. Let's put in a nice BR tag here again. And let's see what we get when we do the variable type for 1. And it comes back and says it's a string. Let's do the same thing for variable type 2. And let's go ahead and add another echo BR tag in here, again, just to keep our data nice and readable. There we go. So now it's going to get the type for 1 and then the type for 2. And it'll come back and tell us that it's an integer. So it did successfully switch the type, and the end result was an integer. Now that we know how to get the type, let's learn how to actually switch the type for ourselves. And we can do that with setType, and we're going to put in variable2, that's the one that just came back as an integer, and we're going to tell it that we want it to be a string. Put a semicolon at the end, and then let's go ahead and just copy our echo BR here, just so that it's nice and readable. And then we'll copy this whole line where we're displaying the type of variable2 so that it'll do it a second time. The first time, we already know it's going to respond with integer. Then we're going to change it to the type string, and it should respond with string the second time. And sure enough, there it is. So now it's actually a string again. It's the number 5, but it's 5 in quotes. And it, of course, would gladly change that back for us automatically to an integer if we needed to work with it again. But it's a little bit different. And we can start to use string functions on it because it's a string as opposed to number functions on it because it's a number. The other way that you can set a type on something is going to be by referring to it using the type first. let me show you how that works. We'll say variable 3 is going to be equal to, and then in parentheses, I'm going to write int for integer, and then a space, and then string var 1 with a semicolon. So now that I've assigned variable 3 and I've told it, look, take this string and make it an integer, I'm going to just take this line up here where we echo back the type, and I'm going to now ask for variable 3 to get what that is, save my document, and I'll come back over here and you'll see that now it tells me that it's an integer again. So up here is where it said it was a string. When I assigned it to variable 3, it became an integer again. And we can do the same thing with other types. You can look at the php.net website and it'll give you more information about these. These are often short abbreviations. It might not be obvious to you that this should be int for integer. You'll start to get a feel for them as you use them more. In truth, most of the time, if you've done your programming right, you'll be working with the right type, and you won't need to do a lot of switching. But the few times when it does come up, I want you to know how to handle it. The last thing I want to show you on this is that it is possible to test for which type you're using. So we'll go ahead and I'll just paste in a block of PHP here for you, which is going to echo back to us whether something is an array, is Boolean, is a float, is integer. And again, the results of this is a test. It's going to be Boolean. We talked about Booleans. So it's going to be a test, true or false. So we're going to end up getting zeros or ones output to our browser. And you'll see here that int has actually got a slightly different color. That's because there's two forms of it. And we can actually say is integer as well. So either of those will work, and it'll tell us whether or not it's an integer or not. Let's go ahead and just try it and see what variable 1 comes back as when we run all those tests. And you'll see that the only one that returned true was way down here. And sure enough, that's the one that says it's a string. And we can actually try that here. Let's just say string. And sure enough, string is the one that returned true because that's the type of variable 1. So we'll learn how to apply these Boolean statements of true or false, but we'll be able to test whether something has a certain type. We'll be able to get its type if we need it. We'll be able to switch the type and set it. Or we can let PHP do its best just to juggle the type on its own. Now that we understand all of the major types and we understand how to switch between the types, there's one last special kind of type that I want to talk about, which is going to be constants, before we move on and talk about control flow operators. So we'll cover constants in the very next movie.